Welcome back, everyone. Okay, today we are tackling an issue that, well, it might just dictate the survival of modern society. Literally, we've got a truly fascinating explainer lined up for you, and we're unpacking a groundbreaking book from South Korea called Rural Economics, written by Choi-min Shik and Lee So-jin. Now, if you've ever looked at rural decline and felt that sinking sense of inevitability, this analysis is going to completely flip your perspective. This isn't just another sad plea to save the countryside. No, it's a rigorous, hard-hitting academic revolution that redefines how we look at spatial economics and, honestly, our very survival as a civilization. Let's dive right in.
So picture this. A researcher stands before an empty village. We've all seen this imagery, right? Closed schools, shut down clinics, aging households just kind of nestled among empty, decaying houses. It's a very emotional, almost haunting picture. But here's the catch. When that researcher reaches into their academic toolkit to explain why this is happening and how this space actually operates, they run into a massive brick wall. The authors point out that our traditional disciplines, they only grab one tiny little corner of this reality. And this brings us to what the authors call the failed tools problem. Think about it. If you open a textbook on agricultural economics, you'll get these incredibly precise data points on a farm's production functions or crop prices. But that vision stops strictly at the farm fence. It misses the actual community entirely. On the flip side, if you turn to regional economics, you get spatial variables, sure, but that entire discipline was basically built to explain urban agglomeration, why cities grow dense. It completely bypasses the unique mechanics of low-density spaces. So neither tool can grasp the whole village, because a village is production and life, ecology and community, all turning together like gears in a giant clock. This leads to a really fascinating core thesis. The authors argue that our crisis isn't just demographic. It actually stems from a profound academic deficit. We literally lacked the language to explain rural spaces without resorting to emotional pity or treating them like a charity case. We just didn't have an integrated framework. The authors beautifully note that filling the academic void and filling the empty village are actually remarkably similar tasks. We have to build the framework first to even understand the space we're trying to save. To fill that void, the authors introduce the triangle model. Instead of just writing off the countryside as this one-dimensional agriculture sector, they map it across three interlocking axes: economy, society, and space. The economy axis goes way beyond just farming. It pulls in tourism, bioindustry, the digital economy. The society axis looks at population dynamics, the care economy, and cooperatives. And the space axis? That anchors the whole thing in land use, infrastructure, and finance. The sheer genius here isn't just listing out these elements, it's showing how these three dimensions constantly constrain and reinforce each other as one massive, complex system. Building on this framework is where the book's discipline really, truly shines. The authors strictly replace that emotional pity with rigid, cold economic logic. They use utility and production functions, they analyze transaction costs and map spatial accessibility. They literally bake factors like low-density living, an aging demographic, and mobility constraints right into their economic equations as structural coefficients. This is a huge statement. It basically declares that rural phenomena deserve the exact same rigorous, hard math analysis as anything happening in a bustling metropolis. Armed with that math, the book takes on its biggest opponent, the extinction myth. In South Korea, and let's be honest, in many parts of the developed world, rural areas are almost exclusively talked about in terms of decay and disappearance. The authors directly challenge this popular demographic determinism. Those theories suggesting that if a region loses its young population, it's just going to automatically vanish off the map. They argue that this linear prediction completely ignores the broader ecological and civilizational realities at play. To understand how we bought into this extinction myth in the first place, we have to trace a massive historical shift in economic thought. Let's go back to the 1950s. Under the Lewis model, mainstream growth theory viewed rural areas simply as a reservoir of cheap labor, a pool to drain into the cities for industrialization. Fast forward to the 2000s, and this morphed into the extinction theory, where we just obsessively focused on that demographic drain. But today, the authors propose this Sieve Ayres model, pushing back against this entire historical narrative. They argue that the rural area was never a disposable labor pool. It was always civilization's essential water tank. To prove this, they synthesize three absolute heavyweights of historical and economic thought. They pull from Jared Diamond's Conditions for Societal Collapse, Karl Polanyi's warnings about the absolute catastrophe of turning everything into a fictitious commodity, and Acemoglu and Robinson's work on inclusive institutions. By weaving all these together, the authors present a chilling but absolutely crucial point. A rural crisis is not just localized decay.
It is the erosion of our entire civilizational foundation.
So the anchor concept here is CIVRS, which stands for Civilization Resilience. This model posits that if our material, social, or spatial foundations fall below a certain critical threshold, the entire civilization faces irreversible collapse. Just think about the magnitude of that statement for a second. We aren't just talking about a quaint little farming town going under. We are talking about the structural integrity of modern society facing a total irreversible collapse if we let these foundational pillars crumble.
And here is exactly how that resilience is structured. The CIVRS model relies on three vital structural spines. First, you've got the material or economic spine. This is your food security, energy independence, and resource circulation. Second, the social spine. This means the regeneration of trust, reciprocity, and community norms. And third, the spatial spine. We're talking ecosystem services, carbon absorption, balanced land use. Now, why is this the absolute crux of the whole issue? Because the rural landscape is literally the only physical space where all three of these vital spines intersect. It is the absolute front line of maintaining human civilization. This flips our current policy mindset completely on its head. The old, mainstream view, it looks at rural investment as a passive subsidy to patch up a market failure, like it's a charity handout. But the new view presented in rural economics argues that investing in the countryside is actually macro insurance for system survival. Resilience isn't something nature just hands us for free. It has to be deliberately designed and institutionally funded. And making this shift requires a fundamental flip in the core question economics actually asks. Traditional growth theory has spent the last century asking, how do we produce more, as if the world is just one giant invincible factory line. But this book introduces a civilization-level economics that asks, how do we not collapse? Because guys, when non-market foundations like food security, water retention, and social trust collapse, our broader inclusive institutions are going down right along with them. Now you might be wondering, how on earth did mainstream economics miss this? Well, the book points out that even the greatest minds had a massive blind spot. Thomas Piketty saw the purity of land rents over urban capital. Bertrand Russell saw how grain prices were manufactured. Noam Chomsky saw the paradox of farmers' voices being tied strictly to their headcount. They all grazed the edges of this issue, but they somehow totally missed the rural core. Treating agriculture as a declining industry to be managed wasn't a neutral scientific conclusion. It was a deliberate civilizational choice that mainstream economics made by design. This brings us to the book's absolute intellectual climax. The place economics abandoned first is exactly where it must return. What's so fascinating here is that this book itself perfectly mirrors its message. It wasn't written by some massive academic publisher in the bustling capital city of Seoul. It was written by a regional researchers cooperative. It's a brilliant piece of economics written from the periphery, proving that the periphery is actually the center of our existence. Instead of awkwardly applying outside theories to rural areas, it builds an entirely new economic science, starting from the rural area as the baseline. So, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to take away from today's explainer. Look at the policies in your own country or region and ask yourself, are we treating rural investment as a charity case for a dying space, or are we properly valuing it as our ultimate macro insurance policy for civilization? Once you start viewing the countryside through the lens of the CVRS model as the vital intersecting spine of our material, social, and spatial survival, you can literally never look at an empty village the same way again. It's not a leftover space, it is our lifeline. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep questioning the frameworks around you.